December 24th, 1945. Snow drifts quietly over the barbed wire of a U.S. prisoner of war camp in the rolling fields of Western Germany. The wind bites through torn uniforms and threadbare blankets. Beyond the fence, the faint glow of lanterns flickers from the American compound. Warm, yellow light cutting through a sea of white silence. Inside one of the wooden barracks, 30 German women sit huddled together. Nurses, clerks, radio operators, all prisoners now. Their faces are pale, eyes hollow from months of uncertainty. Someone whispers about home, about Christmas Eve, Heilig Abend. Then, across the frozen yard, a sound breaks the stillness. A melody, soft, hesitant, unmistakable. Silent Night. Sung in English, carried by deep American voices. The women freeze. For a moment, they think it's mockery. But the tone is gentle, almost reverent. An American guard opens the door. He doesn't shout. He simply gestures toward the light. "Come join us," he says. The women exchange stunned glances, unsure whether to trust this strange invitation. And that's how one of the war's quietest miracles began. By the final months of World War II, the German war machine was bleeding from every front. Cities lay in ruins, fuel reserves were gone, and entire divisions had ceased to exist. Yet even as the Reich crumbled, its demands for manpower and woman power only grew more desperate. By 1944, nearly 500,000 German women served the military effort. Some worked as Luftwaffe auxiliaries, plotting aircraft movements in underground command centers. Others became communications clerks, field nurses, or anti-aircraft spotters defending bombed-out cities. They wore uniforms, carried rank, and served under military command. But when captured, their status was ambiguous. Were they soldiers or civilians? As Allied forces advanced through France and into Germany, tens of thousands of these women found themselves trapped amid the collapse. The Waffen-SS retreated in chaos, leaving medical and support units behind. Entire columns of unarmed auxiliaries, women barely out of their teens, stumbled westward, hoping to surrender to the Americans rather than the Red Army. They had heard what happened on the Eastern Front. By May 1945, the U.S. Army had processed over 400,000 German prisoners of war in temporary enclosures scattered across Europe. Among them were small groups of women, nurses from field hospitals, communications aides, clerical staff, and camp personnel captured after the surrender. The Americans were unprepared. The Geneva Convention recognized combatants, not typists. Most U.S. camps were built for men. Vast open fields of mud, wire, and tents. The arrival of female POWs caused logistical and moral dilemmas: where to house them, how to guard them, and how to treat them without violating convention or decency. In the first months, confusion reigned. Some women were interrogated as potential intelligence sources. Others, mistakenly, as war criminals. But as the dust settled, the American command issued strict guidelines. All captured German women, regardless of role, were to be treated according to Geneva standards of humane confinement. That order changed everything. In makeshift camps across France, Belgium, and Western Germany, American officers established small segregated sections for female prisoners. They were given barracks, medical aid, and rationed food. Some even worked in camp hospitals, tending to wounded soldiers, both German and Allied. For many of these women, it was their first encounter with the enemy as human beings. Gone were the images painted by Nazi propaganda of barbaric Americans. The guards were mostly young, 19, 20 years old. Some from Texas farms, others from New York streets. They shared cigarettes, sometimes awkward smiles, and, when rules allowed, conversation. But December 1945 brought something different. The war was over. Germany lay in ruins. Most POWs, male and female alike, had accepted their fate: to wait, sometimes for months, for repatriation. Yet amid the hunger and despair of post-war Europe, a few American-run camps began preparing something small, something symbolic, a Christmas gathering. What began as a gesture among American soldiers soon turned into an invitation that would cross the very lines war had drawn. And for a group of weary German women behind barbed wire, it would become a night they would never forget. By late 1945, the United States was managing the largest network of prisoner-of-war facilities in modern history. Across Europe, from the French countryside to the banks of the Rhine, sprawling compounds of barbed wire and wooden huts housed millions of surrendered Axis soldiers. But among these, a few held a rare sight: female prisoners of the defeated Reich. To understand the meaning of that Christmas night, one must first understand the philosophy behind American captivity. Unlike the Soviet or French systems, which often used POWs for retribution or hard labor, the U.S. Army viewed its camps as an extension of military order. The Geneva Convention of 1929 guided every procedure. POWs were to receive adequate food, medical care, and shelter, and were to be protected from humiliation or violence. For many Americans, these were not abstract rules. They were moral boundaries. The U.S. public had seen the brutality of war. Buchenwald, Dachau, the death marches, and though anger toward Germany ran deep, there was also a strong desire to demonstrate the opposite of Nazi cruelty. But theory met reality when the first female prisoners arrived. Some were captured nurses from field hospitals along the Rhine. Others were members of the Luftwaffe Helferinnenkorps, the Women's Auxiliary, trained to operate communications and anti-aircraft systems. A few were SS auxiliaries, their roles less innocent, their presence more complicated. American guards, most of whom had never seen women in uniform, let alone as prisoners, were unsure how to behave. Orders were strict: no fraternization, no gifts, no personal contact. Yet daily life inside the camps had its own rhythm, and humanity has a way of breaking through regulation. Letters written by American soldiers describe it vividly. One corporal from the 106th Infantry wrote to his mother, "They look tired, Ma. Not dangerous, just lost. We give them soup when we can. They say danke, and it's strange. Feels like peace." The war had ended 7 months earlier, but peace had not yet begun. Across Europe, millions were displaced. Refugees, orphans, wounded soldiers, civilians. The POW camps, ironically, were among the most stable places left. Prisoners received rations, medical attention, even books or paper for writing home. By December, many camps began preparing for their first peacetime Christmas. American soldiers hung makeshift decorations, scraps of tinsel, hand-cut stars, candles melted to the stubs. Chaplains organized services. Bands rehearsed carols to ease homesickness. Some officers saw an opportunity. Christmas, they believed, could be used to demonstrate the ideals the United States wanted to represent: mercy, decency, humanity. At several camps, including those near Remagen, Heilbronn, and Andernach, invitations were quietly extended to small groups of German POWs, even women, not to blur discipline, but to share food, music, and prayer. It was an extraordinary gesture in a world still smoldering from war. Many German women, raised under years of Nazi indoctrination, were stunned by the civility. Their captors spoke gently, offered them coffee, even let them sit near the warmth of a stove. For the Americans, it was a way to end the year, and perhaps the war, with a statement of conscience. For the Germans, it was the first sign that humanity had survived the rubble. And as the night of December 24th approached, one small camp, its name lost to time, prepared to host a Christmas Eve that would blur the line between prisoner and guard, enemy and friend. That night would reveal not the brutality of conquest, but the endurance of compassion. The war had stripped people of identities. Uniforms replaced names, ranks replaced families. But inside that American camp on Christmas Eve, 1945, humanity began to reappear, piece by fragile piece. The German women who sat behind the barbed wire that winter came from every corner of the Reich. Some had volunteered out of duty or propaganda. Others had been drafted by circumstance. A few had lost brothers on the Eastern Front or fathers in the firestorms of Hamburg and Dresden. All had been told that capture by the Allies would mean humiliation or death. Instead, they found rules, order, and now an invitation. That evening, as the guards lit kerosene lamps and a group of GIs arranged benches in the snow, a dozen women hesitated by the gate. They wore mismatched coats over gray uniforms. The air smelled of pine and cold iron. Their hands trembled, not from cold, but from uncertainty. Across the wire, Americans in heavy coats laughed quietly, tuning a battered accordion. Some looked just as nervous as the women they had invited. In that brief, surreal moment, both sides seemed to recognize the same exhaustion. For nearly 6 years, they had lived in separate worlds built on fear and obedience. Now, under a frozen sky, those worlds touched. One German nurse, perhaps 20 years old, would later recall in an interview, "I expected hatred. Instead, they gave us bread and coffee. It was impossible to understand." The impossible had begun to happen. Enemies were seeing each other as human beings again. For many of the young U.S. soldiers guarding POW camps, the war's end brought confusion rather than celebration. Some had fought in the Ardennes. Others had walked through the shattered streets of Cologne or seen the horrors of Buchenwald. They carried images no Christmas could erase. When the idea of a joint gathering first circulated, some men opposed it. "After what they did," one sergeant said, "why should we sing with them?" Others argued that mercy was the only thing separating civilization from revenge. In the end, compassion won. The decision was not made lightly. Camp commanders instructed guards to maintain order. No alcohol, no gifts beyond shared rations. But within those limits, something remarkable occurred. Ordinary soldiers began preparing the camp hall as if it were their own home. Empty ration tins became candle holders. A wooden crate turned into a makeshift altar. A Red Cross parcel was opened to reveal sugar, chocolate, and a few precious tins of coffee. Someone hung a cardboard star above the door. That night, when the German women entered, many soldiers stood silently, unsure whether to salute, smile, or simply look away. They were young men, barely older than the prisoners, yet the weight of war had made them feel ancient. One private, interviewed years later, said, "I didn't see an enemy that night, just tired people. Same as us." It was a simple realization, but one that echoed far beyond the camp's fences. Christmas had survived even the Third Reich. Despite the Nazi regime's attempts to politicize or secularize it, for both Germans and Americans, the holiday remained sacred, a night of warmth, faith, and memory. When the two groups found themselves together that night, they shared a language older than war. Music. The Americans began with Silent Night, Stille Nacht. The melody was familiar on both sides. As voices rose into the frozen air, a few German women hesitated, then joined in softly, singing the original words. The harmony was fragile, trembling at first, but then steady. For a few minutes, the sound of war, gunfire, engines, orders, was replaced by something older and gentler. The cultural gap between victors and defeated narrowed. A shared belief in something greater than ideology filled the silence. In that moment, neither side represented a nation. They represented humanity remembering itself. For the Americans, the act reaffirmed the moral clarity they had fought for. For the Germans, it was the first hint that defeat did not mean the end of dignity. As the final verse faded into the night, both sides remained still. There was no applause, only the soft crackle of the fire and the faint sound of someone quietly weeping. That night would linger in memory, not because of speeches or ceremonies, but because it proved that even after the worst war in human history, compassion could still survive inside its ashes. From these first shared carols, a new understanding began to form, one that would soon deepen in ways neither side expected. For months, the women had lived behind wire, their identities erased, their futures unknown. The sudden act of kindness that Christmas night didn't erase the trauma of war, but it did something subtler. It fractured the emotional walls built by 6 years of propaganda. Many of these women had believed, sincerely, that capture meant degradation or death. They had been taught that Americans were monsters, merciless occupiers who would humiliate them. Yet now, as they sipped warm coffee offered by the very men they were told to fear, something inside them shifted. They began to question what else had been a lie. Historians later found diary fragments from female POWs describing this moment. One wrote, "I was ready for hatred. Instead, I saw boys, kind, respectful, tired. It was then I realized how much we had been deceived." This quiet psychological awakening rippled through many camps. The image of the enemy began to crumble. Shame, confusion, and relief mixed into a single emotional current. The women realized they were still alive, not because of luck, but because their captors had chosen restraint over revenge. For the Americans, too, the night left its mark. Guards who had seen death and destruction found in that simple gesture a small measure of healing. "It helped us remember we were human again," one veteran later reflected. The war had ended in ruins. Compassion had begun to rebuild what ideology had destroyed. Christmas had always carried a spiritual gravity, but in 1945 it meant something deeper. Europe was scarred, its faith tested by unimaginable violence. Yet within that small camp, religion was not about victory or conversion. It was about survival of conscience. An American chaplain, assigned to oversee the gathering, placed a simple wooden cross on a crate and read from the Gospel of Luke. The words were familiar to both sides. Peace on earth, goodwill toward men. There was no sermon about justice or punishment. No triumphalism, just silence and shared reverence. For many German prisoners, the moment was almost unbearable. They had lived under a regime that had twisted faith into fanaticism. Now, hearing those same scriptures spoken by the enemy, without hatred, without arrogance, was deeply humbling, one recalled. It felt like being forgiven before even asking. The chaplain later wrote in his report, "I saw their faces, not soldiers, not foes, but souls burdened by war." That night, forgiveness didn't need words. The moral significance of that night extended far beyond the camp's wire. It stood as a quiet rebuke to the vengeance that had consumed so much of Europe. It showed that mercy could exist even when it wasn't deserved, and that perhaps that was its purest form. In the months following that Christmas, stories of similar encounters emerged from other U.S.-run camps. In Aversa, Italy, American medics shared food with captured German nurses. In Marburg, U.S. guards invited female auxiliaries to a makeshift chapel service. In Reims, French civilians joined an Allied gathering that included former enemies. Though small and often undocumented, these moments carried weight. They signaled the beginning of a moral shift, a move away from total warfare toward the possibility of reconciliation. The humane treatment of POWs became a cornerstone of the post-war order. American commanders, aware that the world was watching, emphasized dignity as strategy. They knew the moral authority of the Allies rested not only on defeating tyranny, but on proving that freedom meant compassion. These women, anonymous, forgotten by history, became silent witnesses to that transformation. When they were finally repatriated months later, many carried memories of kindness that contrasted sharply with the world they returned to. A few even wrote to their former guards, sending photographs or simple words of thanks. One letter, preserved in a U.S. Army archive, reads, "We were your prisoners, yet you treated us as people. In that, you won something greater than victory." Such gestures did not erase the atrocities of war. They did not justify the ideology those prisoners once served. But they revealed something deeper about the human condition, that even at its lowest point, humanity seeks connection, not destruction. That Christmas night behind barbed wire became more than an act of goodwill. It became a quiet turning point, a symbol that the world could heal, one act of mercy at a time. And soon, the night's emotional warmth would lead to its most powerful moment, when music, food, and fragile laughter would dissolve the last barrier between captor and captive. The camp was silent, except for the crunch of boots in the snow. The wind carried the faint scent of pine and smoke, the kind of smell that might have once meant Christmas back home. But for the 30 or so German women inside the wire, home was now a word from another life. On the American side, preparations were modest, but heartfelt. A small mess hall, its wooden walls patched with canvas, glowed faintly from kerosene lanterns. A few soldiers had strung ration box labels like paper garlands. Someone had carved a star from scrap metal and fixed it to the wall above a crate that served as an altar. At 1900 hours, the gates opened. A single guard gestured gently, and a line of women stepped through, their breaths white in the cold, their faces pale with uncertainty. No rifles were raised, no orders barked. The air was filled only with the slow rhythm of cautious footsteps. Inside, the Americans stood waiting. Young men in thick wool coats, faces tired but kind, moved aside to make space. They offered gestures, not words. There was too much language between them for words to matter. Then came the music. A corporal from Kansas picked up his accordion, pressing out the slow, familiar notes of Silent Night. The sound was rough, imperfect, but it was enough. Slowly, the room began to hum with the tune, first in English, then softly, uncertainly, in German. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. The voices met like two rivers merging after a long, violent journey. No one conducted, no one led. It was simply shared memory. One song, two languages, the same emotion. For a moment, the room ceased to be a prison hall. It was simply a space of warmth in a frozen world. When the last note faded, an American chaplain stepped forward. He spoke briefly, not of politics, not of victory, but of peace. "Tonight," he said, "we remember that even in darkness, light exists." He bowed his head, and so did everyone else, soldiers and prisoners alike. Then came the food. It wasn't much. Hardtack softened in broth, tinned meat, a little coffee, and a handful of Red Cross chocolates. But it was shared equally. No one was first. The same spoon, the same pot, the same silence of gratitude. The women ate slowly, almost reverently. One of them, a nurse from Hamburg, began to cry quietly. An American private, unsure what to do, pushed a cup of coffee toward her. She nodded once, unable to speak. Outside, snow began to fall again, thicker now, muffling the world in white. Through the cracks in the wooden walls, the light from the lanterns spilled into the night, a small golden glow surrounded by wire and shadow. In that moment, something invisible yet unmistakable happened. The war, the hatred, the propaganda, the fear, seemed to loosen its grip. Later, one of the guards wrote in his notebook, "We didn't win anything that night. We just stopped losing what the war had taken." It was the simplest description of a miracle, that didn't make the newspapers, didn't appear in any military report, but lived on in memory and in the quiet dignity of those who witnessed it. By midnight, the gathering began to dissolve. The women were escorted back toward their barracks, their faces soft with disbelief. Some turned once more toward the mess hall, as if to memorize the sight, the flicker of light, the shadowed figures of men who, for one night, were no longer enemies. A few exchanged quiet words of thanks. Danke, frohe Weihnachten. The Americans nodded, replying softly, Merry Christmas. The gates closed behind them, but something within had opened, a recognition that even after all that was lost, compassion remained undefeated. That night was not recorded in any official military communique. It was too small, too human to fit into history's formal pages. Yet for those who were there, it became the clearest memory of peace they would ever know. And as the lanterns dimmed and silence returned to the camp, no one could have imagined that the next morning would deepen this connection even further, in a way none of them had expected. Dawn came quietly. The camp's floodlights had been turned off for the night, and now the soft gray of winter morning crept across the frost-hardened ground. The snow had stopped falling, leaving a white stillness that seemed almost reverent. Inside the barracks, the German women awoke slowly, as if uncertain whether the previous night had been real. Some still held the small pieces of chocolate they'd been given, wrapped in foil, untouched, like fragile proof that kindness could exist even in captivity. There was no roll call that morning. The American guards moved quietly, allowing the camp to remain calm. For the first time in months, there was no shouting, no marching, no barked orders, only the distant crackle of fires and the murmur of voices. One of the guards, Private Harold Dawson, later wrote in his diary, "They smiled at us today. The women, not the tight, fearful kind, but real smiles. I don't think I'll ever forget it." The Americans, too, were changed. The bitterness that had followed them from Normandy and the Ardennes had eased, if only slightly. Many of them had seen more death than any human should, and yet here, in a camp of defeated enemies, they had found a glimpse of life returning to normal. As the sun rose, the chaplain visited the women's barracks. He carried a worn Bible, its cover frayed from months of travel. He spoke softly, offering them words of comfort and a prayer for their families wherever they might be. The women listened silently, some weeping quietly, others staring into the distance. When he finished, one of them stepped forward. She was young, perhaps 23, her uniform sleeves too long for her arms. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small paper flower, folded from a scrap of ration wrapping. She handed it to him, saying in halting English, "For peace." The chaplain accepted it, his eyes wet. "Thank you," he said. "For hope." Outside, the guards had gathered near the fence. Someone had managed to find an old record player in a supply crate, and a few American soldiers huddled around it, cranking the handle until the music began. Scratchy, distant, but unmistakable. "I'll be home for Christmas." The sound drifted across the yard, through the wire into the women's quarters. It was a cruel song in some ways. All of them, soldiers and prisoners alike, were far from home, but it bound them together in shared longing. One American corporal turned to his friend and said, "Guess we all want the same thing, huh?" The other nodded. "Yeah, just to go home." It was in that quiet understanding, more than in any ceremony or speech, that reconciliation began. Later that day, the camp's mess sergeant arranged for the leftover food to be divided among the prisoners. Extra bread, a little sugar, and even a few cigarettes were sent to the women's barracks. Officially, it was a Christmas allowance. Unofficially, it was a gesture of gratitude. That evening, as the sky dimmed once more, a few of the German women gathered near the wire. On the other side stood a small group of American guards. They didn't speak. They simply exchanged nods, a silent farewell to the miracle they had shared the night before. In later years, historians studying Allied POW policy would point to such small acts of decency as instrumental in shaping the post-war order. The humane treatment of German prisoners, especially women, became a quiet yet powerful counterpoint to the brutality seen elsewhere in Europe. But for the people who lived it, it was not policy. It was humanity rediscovered. One former POW interviewed in 1957 recalled, "We were enemies yesterday, but that night they treated us as people. That's when I understood that Germany had truly lost, and that maybe it was good that we had." The Christmas truce inside that camp was not a grand historical event. No cameras recorded it, no generals ordered it. It happened because ordinary people, exhausted by hatred, chose kindness for a single night. And sometimes, that's enough to change everything. As darkness returned and the snow began to fall again, the camp's lights flickered on. Beyond the wire, the sound of laughter, faint but real, drifted through the air. The same wire that once divided victor and vanquished now shimmered under the snow like a fragile thread between two worlds. For both sides, the war was truly over. The quiet of that morning would not last forever. Soon, repatriation orders, bureaucracy, and the grinding machinery of post-war reconstruction would resume. But in memory, that night endured as something rare and sacred. A small, shining proof that even after humanity's darkest hour, compassion could still find its voice. Spring arrived late in 1946. The snow melted reluctantly, revealing muddy paths between the barracks and guard towers. The once barren trees along the fence began to bud again, hesitant signs of renewal after years of destruction. The German women were thinner now, but stronger. They worked daily in the camp kitchen and infirmary, cleaning, repairing, nursing, reclaiming the small rhythm of life. What had begun as survival had slowly become something gentler, almost dignified. They no longer flinched when the Americans passed. The guards, too, had changed. Many of them had stopped seeing prisoners. They saw tired women who had once served a collapsing nation, who now longed only for home. Private Dawson, the same soldier who had written about their smiles, noted again in his journal, "Funny thing, when we first got here, we thought we were keeping them alive. Now I think maybe they're keeping us human." Every few weeks, news would arrive from beyond the wire. Germany was in ruins, cities bombed flat, families scattered, hunger everywhere. But there was also word of rebuilding, of elections, of a new beginning rising slowly from the ashes. For the women behind the fence, those whispers of normal life were like fragments of light through a cracked door. One morning, a truck arrived carrying Red Cross parcels, food, soap, and letters from home. Some of the women hadn't heard from their families in years. When the packages were opened, laughter broke out for the first time since the war's end. One found a small tin of jam. Another unwrapped a knitted scarf that still smelled faintly of home. That afternoon, one of the guards noticed something unusual. The women were singing again, not military songs or marches, but quiet folk tunes, lullabies from Bavaria, hymns from Saxony. The melody carried across the camp, echoing softly against the watchtowers. It reminded everyone of that night in December, the night when the war had briefly stopped mattering. The camp commander, a fair-minded captain from Kansas named Robert Hensley, saw the change as well. He ordered that small educational programs be started. Language lessons, basic accounting, sewing workshops, to prepare the women for reintegration once they were released. "They've got to go back as people, not ghosts," he told his adjutant. Hensley's superiors approved, and soon American and German women were sitting side by side in makeshift classrooms. The awkward silence of captivity slowly gave way to quiet conversation, even laughter. When the Red Cross representatives visited again, they reported, "Morale in this camp is remarkably high. The prisoners speak with respect for their captors, and the guards display uncommon empathy. It is an example worth studying." That report would later reach Geneva and even Washington, where it helped shape the evolving Allied policy toward German prisoners, emphasizing dignity and re-education over punishment. But for the women themselves, none of this was politics. It was simply survival, made bearable by unexpected mercy. One evening in late April, as the sky glowed orange with the setting sun, a small group of American guards gathered near the main gate. The first group of women was being released. Each carried a small bundle of belongings, a folded document of discharge, and eyes filled with tears they tried not to show. Before stepping through the gate, one turned and said in English, "Thank you for not hating us." The guard, a young man barely 20, didn't know how to answer. He just saluted. She did the same, and then she walked into the distance, toward a homeland she no longer recognized, but finally free to rebuild it. That Christmas night had passed into memory, yet its spirit lived on. In every handshake across former battle lines, in every act of forgiveness, and in every quiet decision to rebuild instead of destroy, the world was learning, painfully and slowly, that even in war's ruins, peace begins with how we treat the defeated. By the end of 1946, most of the women had been repatriated. They boarded trucks that rumbled east, toward a country in ruins, toward cities reduced to skeletons of brick and ash. Yet, even as they vanished from the American camps, something of them remained behind. The guards spoke of them often, not with pity, but with quiet respect. For those soldiers, the women had become a symbol of what the war had really cost. Beneath the uniforms, beneath the flags and slogans, both sides had been human, frightened, exhausted, and desperate to believe that something decent still existed in the world. At Camp Heilbronn, a chaplain wrote in his post-war diary, "They arrived as enemies, but left as mirrors. They showed us how close we had come to losing our own humanity." That sentiment echoed across dozens of camps throughout occupied Germany. In the years that followed, historians and journalists often overlooked these smaller human stories, overshadowed by trials, treaties, and the birth of the Cold War. But to those who were there, the memory of that Christmas never faded. For the German women, the experience reshaped everything they thought they knew about America and about mercy. When they returned to Germany, they found cities buried in silence, fathers lost, mothers starving, children scavenging through rubble. Yet, they also carried with them a lesson that no propaganda could erase: that compassion could exist even on the other side of war. Many of them joined rebuilding efforts, working as nurses, translators, teachers. A few became advocates for reconciliation, teaching others that dignity was not a gift of victory, but a responsibility of peace. One, identified later through Red Cross records only as Anna K., would write to her former camp commander in 1948, "You taught me more than any officer ever did. You showed me that a soldier's strength is not in his weapon, but in his restraint." Her letter was kept in a folder marked Christmas 1945, POWW Reports. It remains archived today in the U.S. National Archives under a collection of military ethics studies. For Captain Hensley and his men, the impact was equally profound. After the war, many returned home, married, raised families, but few ever forgot the sight of their enemies sharing food by candlelight in a wooden barracks. When interviewed years later, one veteran said, "That night, we stopped fighting the Germans. We started fighting the hate inside ourselves." It was a small moment in the grand scale of history. One camp, one night, a few songs shared between people who had every reason to despise one another. Yet, somehow it carried the weight of something larger, a quiet declaration that decency had survived the bloodiest war in human history. Historians would later note that the humane treatment of prisoners in the East American zones became a cornerstone of post-war German rehabilitation. It helped shape public attitudes toward democracy, fostered trust in reconstruction efforts, and contrasted sharply with the vengeance many feared after total defeat. That Christmas, born in the cold shadow of surrender, became an invisible thread in the larger fabric of peace, proof that even small mercies can ripple outward across generations. And so, when the last of the guards packed up the camp, when the gates were dismantled and the watchtowers torn down, the field where enemies had once stood apart became quiet once more. In time, grass grew where the fences had been. Birds returned to the trees. Travelers passing through the valley would never guess what had happened there. How, one winter night in 1945, a handful of soldiers and prisoners had chosen empathy over vengeance. But history remembers in silence as much as in words. And in that silence, beneath the ruins of Europe, a seed of peace had been planted.